Inventions change the world. They make life easier, safer, and more exciting. Most of the time. But every once in a while, an invention turns on its creator, leading to some pretty tragic and sometimes bizarre endings. From high-speed railcars to deadly gases and even homemade pulley systems, these stories are a reminder that sometimes innovation comes at a high cost. I'm Mike with List 25, and here are 25 inventions that killed their inventors. 25. The early pioneers. Let's kick off today's list with some of the first motor vehicle pioneers who sadly didn't live to see their inventions take off. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, inventors were building everything from steam-powered bikes to motorized bicycles, none of which had safety features. In 1896, Sylvester H. Roper took his steam-powered velocipede, a sort of early motorcycle, out for a test run. Mid-ride, he suffered a heart attack, lost control, and crashed. Then, there was William Nelson, a GE employee who crafted his own motorized bike in 1903. During his test run, he lost control and was killed. And in 1918, Francis Edgar Stanley, the mind behind the Stanley steamer, died after swerving to avoid a farm wagon on a country road. So, it would seem as if a set of wheels has always been a bit of danger to our health. 24. Frederick Duesenberg. Born in 1876, Fred Duesenberg made his mark on the auto industry with his first car, the Marvel, in 1904, a project he tackled alongside his brother. Just 2 years later, they produced the Hill Climber, a two-cylinder vehicle backed by a supporter's funding. But it was when they shifted to race cars that things really took off. Together, they founded the Duesenberg Motor Company, designing race cars so impressive that, in the 1921 Indianapolis 500, 7 out of the top 10 finishers were Duesenbergs. In fact, some say the word doozy, meaning something exceptional, comes from the Duesenberg name. Tragically, in 1932, while testing out one of his cars in the Pennsylvania mountains, Fred lost control, crashed, and later died from his injuries. 23. Thomas Andrews. Thomas Andrews grew up with a passion for sailing that followed him into adulthood. At 16, he started an apprenticeship at the Harland and Wolff shipyard, diving into shipbuilding and design. He even took night classes to get a better grip on his craft, and by 28, he was leading the design department. In 1908, he drew up plans for 2 big ships, the Olympic, and of course, the Titanic. When the Titanic set out on its ill-fated maiden voyage in 1912, Andrews was on board to monitor the ship's performance and note any improvements. After it struck an iceberg, he was among the first to understand just how bad things were, and told the captain she was going to sink. Andrews spent his last hours helping others into lifeboats, and then went down with the ship he'd helped bring to life. 22. Karl Scheele. Karl Scheele was a gifted pharmaceutical chemist with a taste for discovery. And I mean that literally. In the 18th century, Scheele identified several chemical elements, including chlorine, manganese, and even oxygen, though another scientist published it first. He also stumbled upon a process much like pasteurization. Unfortunately, Scheele had the risky habit of taste testing his own discoveries, which he somehow survived, like when he sampled hydrogen cyanide, one of the deadliest chemicals in the world. But his luck eventually ran out. After years of working with toxic substances, he developed symptoms of mercury poisoning and died. 21. Jean-Francois De Rozier. Jean-Francois De Rozier was a physics and chemistry teacher with a serious passion for flight. In 1783, he saw the first ever balloon launch, and, well, that was it. He was hooked. He joined early test flights, even helping launch a sheep, a chicken, and a duck into the skies. Not long after, De Rozier himself became the first person to make an untethered balloon flight, reaching an altitude of 3,000 feet. But that wasn't enough for him. Rozier set his sights on crossing the English Channel in a new kind of balloon that combined hot air and gas. During the attempt, the balloon deflated at 1,500 feet, and he didn't survive the fall. 20. Alexander Bogdanov. Alexander Bogdanov was a true Renaissance man. Physician, philosopher, economist, science fiction writer, and revolutionary. By 1924, he decided to add Pioneer of Eternal Youth to his list of accomplishments and turned his focus to blood transfusions. After 11 self-administered transfusions, he claimed to see results. His balding had slowed, and his eyesight seemed sharper. However, although transfusions had been practiced for centuries, the risks were still poorly understood, and Bogdanov didn't take the precautions we know are necessary today. In 1928, he used blood from a donor infected with malaria and tuberculosis. He soon fell ill and died, his quest for rejuvenation cut short by the very experiments he'd hoped would keep him young. 19. Marie Curie. Now, I can't have a list of inventors killed by their own inventions without mentioning Marie Curie, right? In 1898, Curie and her husband Pierre discovered radium, sparking her lifelong dedication to radiation research. She studied and pioneered early radiation therapies, often working directly with radioactive materials. Her constant exposure to radiation eventually took its toll, and she developed leukemia, passing away in 1934. Curie was not only the first woman to win a Nobel Prize, but remains the only person to receive Nobel honors in 2 different fields, chemistry and physics. She also made history as the first female professor at the University of Paris, a groundbreaking scientist whose work both saved and cost lives, including her own. 18. Henry Winstanley. Henry Winstanley was a daring English engineer and architect famous for building the first Eddystone Lighthouse. Completed in 1698, it was the world's first open ocean lighthouse, set on the dangerous Eddystone Rocks about 14 miles from Plymouth. Winstanley was so confident in his design that he once declared he'd like to be inside the lighthouse during the greatest storm there ever was. Sadly, he got his wish. In November 1703, during what would come to be known as the Great Storm of 1703, Winstanley insisted on staying in the lighthouse to prove its strength. But the storm, one of the worst in British history, overwhelmed the structure. The lighthouse collapsed, taking Winstanley and 5 others with it. 17. Franz Reichelt. Franz Reichelt, or the Flying Tailor, was a German-born inventor who moved to France with a mission: to create a parachute suit that could save lives. He spent years sewing, testing, and refining his design, convinced that he'd crack the code. By 1912, he was so confident that he secured permission to test his invention from the Eiffel Tower, albeit with a dummy. But on the day of the jump, Reichelt made a shocking announcement. He wasn't going to use a dummy, he was going to do the jump himself. Despite the officials' concerns and skeptical onlookers, he climbed up, suited up, and leaped. The parachute didn't open, and he fell 187 feet to his death in front of the horrified crowd. 16. Cowper Phipps Coles. Cowper Phipps Coles, a decorated Royal Navy captain, made waves in the world of naval design with his invention of the rotating turret for ships during the Crimean War. After seeing his design adapted on other ships, Coles patented it and set out to build his own vessel, the infamous HMS Captain. This ship was an ironclad powerhouse, considered the most powerful battleship in the world at the peak of the Pax Britannica. But fitting it with his turret meant risky adjustments, including a hurricane deck that dangerously raised the ship's center of gravity. Then, on September 6, 1870, during a routine voyage, disaster struck. The HMS Captain capsized, and Coles, along with nearly 500 crew members, went down with his ship. 15. Henry Smolinski. In 1971, Henry Smolinski and his partner Hal Blake set out to bring all that is awesome and great to the flying car market. Their invention, the Ave Mizar, was a mix of a Ford Pinto and the wings of a Cessna Skymaster. The idea wasn't to create a car you could just take off with from your driveway. Instead, you'd fly from one airport to another, land, detach the wings, and drive off. But there was a problem. Those detachable wings, well, they weren't quite as secure as planned. During a routine test flight, the wings came loose mid-air, causing the car-plane hybrid to crash. Both inventors died in the accident. And if you're actually enjoying this list so far, please don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, do all that stuff. Interacting with the channel helps it the most. I know us YouTubers say it all the time, but that's because it works. That helps the algorithm. So if you could do all that, I would truly appreciate it. Thank you guys so much. Let's get back to the list. 14. John Day. Born in 1740, John Day holds the distinction of inventing the first ever submarine, and being the first person to die in one. An English carpenter by trade, Day was fascinated by the idea of exploring deep underwater, even without an engine. With backing from a notorious gambler named Christopher Blake, he set about building a crude diving chamber from wood and attached it to a 50-ton sloop named the Maria. Blake, always up for a bet, challenged Day to descend 130 feet below the surface and stay submerged for 12 hours. Against the odds, Day agreed. On June 22, 1774, he climbed aboard with a candle, water, and biscuits, confident in his plan. But things went wrong quickly. His calculations were way off, and the submarine sank. Day was never seen again. 13. Max Valier. You know the saying, it's not rocket science? Well, for Max Valier, it really was. Valier was one of the world's first rocket scientists, working in the 20s and 30s when rockets were still wildly experimental and risky. Driven by a passion to push technology forward, he dreamed of taking rockets all the way to space. To get the public and funders on board, Valier put on quite a show, strapping rockets to sleds and race cars to wow the crowds. But his real focus was on liquid-fueled rockets, a new and dangerous concept. In one experiment, he used kerosene and liquid oxygen as fuel. The first 2 tests were a success, but on his 3rd attempt, something went horribly wrong. The rocket exploded, and a shard of metal pierced his pulmonary artery, killing him within minutes. Valier's tragic end made him the first person known to die in the pursuit of rocket science. 12. William Pitt. William Pitt, born in 1841, was a Canadian inventor and engineer who dedicated his life to improving ferry travel along New Brunswick's Kennebecasis River. It might not seem exciting, but to locals who depended on his ferries between Gondola Point and Reed Point to get around, Pitt was a key figure in daily life. In 1903, he took things to the next level by inventing an underwater cable system to make his ferry trips faster and more efficient. His new system really changed things, and by the following year, ferry traffic was booming. Then, in 1909, tragedy struck. While doing maintenance on the system he created, Pitt fell into the machinery at one of the landing sites. His injuries were severe, and he didn't make it. Today, one of the ferries still running bears his name, William Pitt II, as a tribute to his impact on the community. 11. Michael Dacre. Michael Robert Dacre, an inventor born in the 1950s, spent much of his life chasing a bold idea, a tiny, efficient aircraft that could work as a flying taxi. His creation, the Avcen jet pod, was designed to take off and land in less than 150 yards. Quiet and compact, it was meant to zip business execs straight into busy cities, touching down on many runways without disrupting the lives of those below. Dacre poured years into perfecting the jet pod, finally rolling out a sleek prototype in 2009. Then, he decided to take it for a spin. After 3 failed takeoff attempts, the 4th try finally got him airborne. But just moments later, less than 1,000 feet up, the jet pod spun out of control. The crash was instant and deadly. 10. John Parry-Thomas. John Parry-Thomas was a fearless race car driver and engineer who, at one point, held the land speed record. In the 20s, he designed and built a streamlined car called Babs, and went off to break that record again. Determined to push his car to its limits, Parry-Thomas attempted a high-speed run at Pendine Sands in Wales in 1927. But at over 170 miles an hour, a drivetrain snapped and whipped through the car, striking him in the head and killing him instantly. Parry-Thomas was the first driver to die in pursuit of the land speed record. 9. Karel Soucek. Karel Soucek, a Canadian stuntman, was no stranger to crazy stunts. His big moment came in 1984 when he took a homemade capsule, which was basically just a modified barrel, over Niagara Falls. He made it through with some serious bruises, but alive, proving his barrel invention could actually survive the falls. But Karel wasn't finished. The next year, he took things up a notch, aiming to drop from 180 feet at the Houston Astrodome. With the support of sponsors, a special waterfall was rigged from the dome's ceiling, ending in a plunge pool. Unfortunately, things didn't go as planned. The capsule missed its target, crashing into the rim of the pool instead. The impact splintered the capsule, and Soucek suffered critical injuries, passing away the next day. Looking back at the tragedy, the legendary stuntman Evel Knievel called it the most dangerous stunt he'd ever seen. Today, Soucek's battered capsule can be seen in the New York State Museum. 8. William Bullock. William Bullock's 1863 invention, the rotary printing press, changed the world as people knew it. Suddenly, printing was faster and more efficient than anyone had thought possible, making newspapers and books way easier to produce. It was a game changer when it came to spreading news and new ideas. But Bullock's own story ended with tragedy. When trying to fix one of his presses, he tried to kick a pulley into place, and his foot got crushed under the machine. Infection set in, and his foot became gangrenous. Doctors decided to amputate, but Bullock didn't make it through the operation. 7. Perillos of Athens. Okay, this one might just be the cruelest item on today's list. Perillos of Athens, a skilled bronze worker from the 6th century BCE, created one of the most horrifying execution devices in history, the Brazen Bull. This hollow bronze bull, designed for the tyrant Valier of Athens, was meant to roast victims alive, with their screams cleverly channeled to sound like a bellowing bull. But, in a brutal twist of fate, Perillos became the first to experience his own invention. When he presented it to Valier, the tyrant ordered Perillos inside to test the device's acoustics. Valier then lit a fire beneath it, subjecting Perillos to his own torture. Though he was pulled out before death claimed him, Valier later had him thrown off a cliff, ensuring the bull's creator didn't live to tell the tale. 6. Sir Humphry Davy. Sir Humphry Davy, the brilliant British chemist, was known for pushing the boundaries of his work, sometimes quite literally into his own lungs. Early in his career, he had a risky habit of inhaling the gases he was experimenting with, an eccentricity that actually led to his groundbreaking discovery of the anesthetic properties of nitrous oxide, or laughing gas. But Davy's risky methods came with serious consequences. Over the years of testing various gases on himself, he experienced multiple poisonings, which severely damaged his health. The frequent exposure left him physically weakened, and he struggled with lingering symptoms for the remaining 2 decades of his life. Davy ultimately spent his last years as an invalid before dying from complications caused by his own experiments. 5. Valerian Abakovski. An inventor and former chauffeur for the Soviet secret police, Valerian Abakovski had a daring vision for a new type of train. In 1921, he pitched the Aerowagon, a high-speed rail car with an airplane propeller mounted at the front. Soviet leaders liked his idea, and soon Abakovski had a test model ready to go. On its maiden journey, the Aerowagon carried Abakovski, Fyodor Sergeyev, a close friend of Stalin, and 4 foreign communist sympathizers. The outbound trip from Moscow to Tula went smoothly, showcasing the Aerowagon's speed and promise. But on the return, disaster struck. Traveling at high speed, the Aerowagon derailed, killing everyone on board, including its inventor. He and the other passengers were buried at the Kremlin Wall necropolis a short time later. 4. Li Shi. Li Shi, born around 280 BCE, was a key figure in China's Qin dynasty, serving as a top minister to King Zheng, who later became Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. Li played a big role in shaping the empire. He helped standardize currency, push for a unified writing system, and oversaw parts of the Great Wall's construction. He even ordered the burning of historical books to keep power consolidated in Qin's hands. But there was a dark side to Li's legacy. He created an execution method called the 5 pains, which involved cutting off the victim's nose, 1 hand, 1 foot, then castrating them, and finally slicing them in half at the waist. Ironically, after Qin Shi Huang's death, Li's own political maneuvering led to his downfall. He was accused of treason and sentenced to die by the very punishment he'd designed. 3. Webster Wagner. Webster Wagner was the guy who turned train travel into a first-class experience. In the mid-1800s, he was working for the New York Central Railroad when he came up with the idea for the sleeping car, and later, the luxury parlor car. Feeling good about his success, Wagner started his own company, the Wagner Palace Car Company, and was successful enough to merge with his biggest competitor, the Pullman Company. With his newfound wealth, he went into politics and served in the New York State Assembly for several terms. But featuring on this list obviously meant it wasn't all rainbows and butterflies. In 1882, Wagner was riding in one of his own luxury train cars when it collided with another train. Wagner was just one of the many people who died after being crushed between the 2 rail cars. 2. Louis Slotin. Louis Slotin, a Canadian scientist, was part of the team behind the first nuclear bomb with the Manhattan Project. During one of his experiments, he accidentally dropped a sphere of beryllium onto another around a plutonium core, triggering a prompt critical reaction. Everyone in the room reported seeing a flash of blue light, followed by an intense wave of heat. Slotin knew immediately something was terribly wrong. He rushed outside, but soon had to be taken to the hospital. His exposure was catastrophic, equivalent to standing a mere 4,800 feet from an atomic blast, and despite medical efforts, he died 9 days later. Following his tragic death, Los Alamos immediately stopped assembling nuclear cores by hand. 1. Thomas Midgley Jr. Thomas Midgley Jr. has one of the strangest and most tragic death by invention stories out there. Midgley developed leaded gasoline by adding tetraethyl lead, and he also invented chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, known under the brand name Freon. Decades later, both would be banned due to their harmful effects on human health and the environment, leaving Midgley with a problematic legacy. But it's his death in 1944 that lands him on this list. In 1940, he contracted polio, and by 1944, he was completely disabled. Never one to sit back, Midgley designed a complex rope and pulley system over his bed so he could lift himself up and get around more easily. Tragically, Midgley strangled himself one day while tangled in the ropes of his own invention. Some speculated it might have been intentional, but, accidental or not, the contraption he'd built to help himself ended up being the one that took his life. And that's all I have for you today. And normally I'd recommend another awesome video at this point. Now we have thousands, but I've got something exciting to share with you. I've just launched a brand new channel called Dark Roast Detective. So if you're into true crime or know anyone that is, and love a good mystery, you're gonna want to check this out. I deep dive into the most intriguing cases and unusual suspects, and I think you're gonna love it. So hit the link, take a look, and you know what? If you're staying here, no worries. I will catch you in the next one. See you soon. But do both.